So the research article that I selected was entitled Children's Expectations of Parent-Child Communication Following Interparental Conflict. Do parents talk to children about conflict? And this study was conducted by Amy Brown, Monica Fitzgerald, Kimberly Shipman, and Renee Schneider. So in this study, they wanted to take a look at how mothers' communication with their children after an interparental conflict occurred in the household affected the children. So in the past, researchers had taken a look at conflict resolution and children's appraisal of conflict after interparental conflict was occurring, and different tactics that parents used post-conflict to discuss with their children. And interparental conflict, it consists of when two parents, whether that be a mother and a father, a mother and her boyfriend, or for other situations, a mother and a mother and a father and a father. That is the basis of an interparental conflict. So they wanted to see how that affected children specifically and how their tactic they chose, the method they used, ultimately, how they were being interpreted by the children. So this research had 3 goals in mind. So they wanted to assess how often mothers were initiating conversations with their children after an interparental conflict had occurred. They also wanted to discover whether children felt like the discussion that they had with their mother was validating or invalidating, as in whether what they said was like comforting after the situation, or if it was like invalid, like maybe they were lying, or they felt like it didn't really do anything to ease their mind after the situation had occurred. And lastly, they wanted to examine the effects that these discussions had on the children's psychological adjustment. So whether they were internalizing these conflicts or externalizing them, as far as maybe they thought maybe they were the reason they were fighting, or perhaps they lacked communication with their mothers because they felt as though there was a barrier there because of how the mothers were communicating after an interparental conflict had occurred. So the researchers selected 75 participants and their mothers. They were children ranging from 6 to 12 years old, both male and female. 80% of the participants were African American, 10% were Caucasian, and the other 10% were biracial. So the mothers were offered a $50 gift card to participate in the study. And some of these studies took place in the home if the parents lacked transportation. Otherwise, the parents met with the researchers and the study was conducted elsewhere. And the researchers selected these specific participants by going to local community organizations, such as like Head Start in more lower income areas. And they had 3 methods. So the first method they used was they played a recording of an interparental conflict, and they asked the children to assess it and view it as if it was their mother or their parents that they were listening to. So they wanted to evaluate it on that basis. Like, pretend this is your family that this conflict is occurring, that you're hearing. And they, after hearing the recording, they asked them how often their mother communicated with them about the conflict. Like if the mother initiated conversation, if the mother avoided conversation, or if she like mentioned it briefly but not so much in depth. And then the children were administered a children's depression inventory, and this evaluated the children's psychological well-being, and it focused like specifically on depression. And so the researchers asked the children to select a sentence that pertained to how the children felt in the last 2 weeks. And this was like 3 different options were available, and they just wanted to see kind of where they fell in line. They didn't specifically tell us what the 3 options were. I know that there were 4 in total, but they took 1 out because it was a little more in regard to suicide, and they felt as though that was inappropriate for this age range of children. And last, they gave the mothers a child behavior checklist, and they asked them to rate using a Likert scale, a 3-point Likert scale, how they felt their children were as far as internalizing or externalizing issues when it came to interparental conflict. So the results showed that 40% of the children were likely to initiate a conversation with their mother because their mothers were likely to initiate conversation with them after an interparental conflict were to occur. They found that 31% of them believed that it was very unlikely that their mother would initiate a conversation with them after an interparental conflict would occur. And therefore, they were kind of less likely to initiate conversation with their mother, like ask questions or bring up the topic. And in regard to the second goal, they reviewed the conversations that children and mothers had as far as whether the child ranked it as validating or invalidating. And 40% of those participants expected that their mother would have a validating conversation with them as far as like give them reassurance or approval, like, hey, it was just a fight. It won't happen again. Or, it's no big deal. I'm sorry you had to hear that. Whereas 5.3 participants said that their mother wouldn't address the issue at all. And it would be like an invalidating response. And 23% stated that they predicted that it would not be a validating conversation, as far as like perhaps they'd blame the child or they wouldn't really mention it at all. They'd kind of go around it or not bring it up and ask them not to bring it up. So the third and final goal asked the mothers to rate on the Likert scale whether the child was internalizing or externalizing the conflicts. And it did show that the mother's response did correlate and affect the child's level of psychological adjustment. So again, whether they initiated conversation or they not, based on how their mother approaches them and what they say as far as a validating conversation or invalidating, it's ultimately how the children start to respond. And so the researchers concluded that basically what they hypothesized, which is what they predicted, was true, that there was a correlation between internalization, externalization of responses from mothers after an interparental conflict would occur on the children, and how the mother initiated conversation or did not ultimately affected whether the child did or did not initiate conversation with the mother, which I think could lead to further instances outside of the home. And I think personally, after reading the article, I feel as though it was informational as far as the importance of talking to your children after, a conflict is to occur within the home, whether that's interparental or any type of conflict at all. I feel like you have to somewhat address the issues that your child knows the right from wrong and doesn't internalize such things. So I feel it was informational because it did say that there was a correlation between the mothers initiating conversation or how they relayed the information, the content of the conversation that they had with their child, definitely correlated to the psychological effects that it had on their children. I thought it was a little bit odd that they went specifically for mothers rather than a general parental approach, how children felt about their mother or their father addressing the issue. I also thought it was a little bit strange that they went for low income. I think that it could be important to see more of a broad spectrum. They should have taken a different approach and did it, cross socioeconomic class and just viewed the differences there. I don't think they should have focused on specifically one socioeconomic class or specifically one culture. There was an 80% dominance with African American children and families, which I think would give more of a biased result versus having a little bit more diversity in there. I think that the article lacked pertinent information. I mean, after reading it, I myself was a little bit confused. I felt like it was very repetitive, as this may appear repetitive. And I think they could have given more information as far as what the recording said, how the recording was administered, how they came to select these particular participants. They just said that they went to local community organizations and asked people to volunteer. They recruited their participants. I think that it just could have been done a little bit more thorough, which also could come from the fact that the article itself was only, I think, 7 pages long. So I think that they tried to push it all into a shorter review, but it definitely left a lot of room for confusion and lack of clarity. And there was, in my opinion, some pertinent information that could have been put in to give more of a better picture of the study that was left out. Overall, I think that, like I said, it was a great article. I think that it was informational, but it definitely could have been done a little bit more thoroughly, and it could have given a little bit more information as far as the depth of the study and what all really the study entailed and why specifically mothers. The other studies that they based this off of did not reference that they went specifically for mothers. Maybe that was their goal. And they wanted to just see how the mother's communication was interpreted. But I personally feel like it should have just been parental, how any parent communicated with the child. A recommendation I have for future research would be to focus more on the psychological effects, not so much as internalizing or externalizing, but exactly how it affected the children. Maybe a survey or interviews, I think, would probably be best, and really ask children how they felt afterward. I think that interparental conflicts certainly take a toll on children, and they set the tone and the basis for later, how children think the communication should take place, because your means of communication firsthand come from home. And so I think that they could have gone beyond internalizing and externalizing. I think a lot of children internalize things, and for a future study, it might be best to do interviews and really ask children, what it means to them, how they interpret them, and maybe what they think could be done differently, or how such situations make them feel.